What if I told you that before Jesus healed the sick, before the blind could see, before the dead were raised, there was a prayer? Not the kind of prayer most of us were taught to pray. Not long, not emotional, not desperate. A prayer so simple and yet so powerful that it almost disappears when you read the Gospels too quickly. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Jesus did not pray the way modern Christianity teaches people to pray. He didn't beg God to intervene. He didn't plead for miracles. He didn't sound unsure. So why do we? Why does our prayer sound like hoping when His sounded like knowing? And why is this specific prayer, the one He consistently used before miracles, almost never explained, emphasized, or taught? Ask yourself this. If Jesus modeled prayer for His followers, why do our prayers look nothing like His? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you may realize that what we've been taught about prayer is incomplete, and that something essential has been quietly left out. But before we dive in, there were voices that said this channel wouldn't grow, that Bible truth doesn't belong here. But look at you. Just by watching, it tells a different story. If you believe God's Word still has power, subscribe to Hidden Genesis, like this video, and turn on the bell, because the story isn't over. Most people believe prayer is about asking God to do something for you, but when you read the words of Jesus closely, a pattern emerges, one that challenges that belief entirely. Before miracles happened, Jesus didn't ask if God would move. He spoke as if the answer was already settled. That should make you pause. Because if prayer is meant to be asking, why did Jesus pray from certainty instead of request? And what happens when prayer stops being about convincing God and starts being about alignment with Him? In the next chapter, we're going to uncover a pattern hidden in plain sight, a repeated moment that happens just before miracles take place, a moment most people overlook, but one that changes everything once you see it. If you read the Gospels slowly enough, something begins to stand out. Not a miracle, not a parable, but a moment before the miracle. A pause. Jesus never rushed power. He never performed wonders impulsively. There was always a quiet space, sometimes only a sentence long, right before everything changed. And in that space, He prayed. But not the way most people imagine prayer. Look at the moments just before the impossible happens, before He feeds thousands with almost nothing, before He calls Lazarus out of death, before He heals bodies that medicine had already given up on. Jesus consistently does something that feels understated. He looks upward. He gives thanks. Not after the miracle, before it. That detail matters more than most people realize. Why would someone thank God for something that hasn't happened yet? Why express gratitude before there is any visible evidence? That isn't hope. That isn't wishful thinking. That is certainty. And certainty only comes from one place: alignment. Jesus prays as if the outcome is already decided, as if heaven and earth are already in agreement. Take the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples are anxious. They see scarcity. They see limits. They see a problem that cannot be solved. Jesus sees something else. He takes the bread. He looks up, and He gives thanks. No request, no explanation, no panic, just gratitude, spoken before multiplication ever begins. Ask yourself this: how often do you thank God before the answer arrives? And if gratitude is an expression of faith, what does it say about the way most of us pray? The same thing happens at Lazarus' tomb. Jesus doesn't cry out in desperation. He doesn't ask God to consider bringing Lazarus back. He says something startling. Father, I thank You that You have heard me. Not will hear me, have heard me. Past tense. The miracle hasn't happened yet, but Jesus speaks as if heaven has already responded. That should stop you, because that prayer reveals something most people miss. Jesus wasn't trying to persuade God. He wasn't trying to unlock power. He was acknowledging alignment that already existed. And that changes how we understand prayer entirely. What if prayer isn't about asking God to move, but about recognizing that God already has? What if the reason this pattern isn't emphasized is because it challenges how we've been taught to approach God? In the next chapter, we're going to confront something even deeper, the difference between praying from identity versus praying from insecurity. Because once you see who Jesus believed he was when he prayed, you'll understand why his prayers carried authority. There's something subtle but critical that separates the prayers of Jesus from almost every prayer we hear today. It isn't vocabulary, it isn't length, it isn't emotion, it's posture. Not the posture of knees or hands, but the posture of the soul. Jesus never approached God as someone unsure of his place. He never sounded like someone trying to get God's attention. Never spoke as though heaven might ignore him. Never prayed as if permission could be revoked. And that alone explains why his prayers carried weight. Because begging only exists where identity is uncertain. You beg when you don't know if you belong. You plead when you're not sure you're welcome. You repeat yourself when you fear silence means rejection. But Jesus did none of that. When he prayed, he spoke like someone who already knew the answer. Not because he was arrogant, but because he was rooted in relationship. This is why his prayers sound so different from ours. Most people pray upward, hoping their words reach far enough. Jesus prayed inward, from connection. That's a difference few people are taught to recognize. Look closely at how he addressed God. Father, not distant creator, not almighty judge, not if it be your will. Father, that single word removes distance, and distance is where powerless prayer is born. Jesus did not try to bridge a gap in prayer. He spoke from union. That's why he could say things that sound shocking if you slow down enough to hear them. I know that you always hear me. Always. Not sometimes. Not when conditions are right. Not when faith feels strong. Always. That sentence alone would feel uncomfortable in most churches today, because it forces a question we often avoid. Why are we taught to pray like access is fragile, when Jesus lived like access was permanent? The truth is, praying like a beggar is not humility, it's confusion. Humility is knowing who you are without exaggeration or denial. And Jesus knew exactly who he was. That's why he never negotiated with God in prayer. He didn't bargain. He didn't over-explain. He didn't perform. He trusted the relationship to carry the request. And here's the part that challenges everything we've inherited. Jesus didn't pray to change God's mind. He prayed because he already knew God's heart. That's why his words were so few. Few words don't come from lack of faith. They come from certainty. When someone knows they're heard, they don't need to shout. And when someone knows they belong, they don't need to beg. So let me ask you something uncomfortable, but honest. If Jesus told his followers to pray, Our Father, why were we taught to pray like outsiders? At what point did prayer become about convincing God, instead of agreeing with him? Because the moment prayer turns into persuasion, authority disappears. And authority was never missing from Jesus' prayers. It flowed naturally, because it was rooted in identity, not effort. In the next chapter, we're going to take this even deeper. We're going to look at where that authority actually came from and why Jesus said something that most people skim past without realizing its weight. I only say what I hear the Father say. Because once you understand that statement, you'll understand why his prayers didn't sound like requests at all. Authority doesn't come from how loud a person speaks. It doesn't come from confidence alone. And it definitely doesn't come from repetition. Authority comes from alignment. When Jesus spoke, things moved. Not because he forced them to, but because his words were already in agreement with something deeper. This is where many people misunderstand power. They assume authority is something you generate, something you summon, something you reach for when you're desperate. But Jesus never treated authority like a tool to be picked up in an emergency. For him, authority was a state of being. He once said something that reveals the source of everything he did. "I only say what I hear the Father say." That line is easy to overlook, but it explains his entire life. Jesus wasn't improvising miracles. He wasn't reacting emotionally to problems. He wasn't deciding in the moment whether to heal or not. He was responding to what was already established. That means his words didn't create power. They released it. Think about how different that is from the way most people pray. Most prayers start with panic, a diagnosis, a loss, a fear of what might happen next. And from that place, words are thrown upward, hoping something sticks. But Jesus never spoke from panic. He spoke from listening. Silence always came before speech. That's why his words were so precise. When he told the storm to be still, he didn't argue with it. When he spoke to sickness, he didn't explain himself. When he confronted death, he didn't negotiate. He spoke once, and it obeyed. Because authority doesn't argue with resistance, it assumes compliance. And that assumption didn't come from ego. It came from alignment with the source of life itself. Here's the truth that challenges modern prayer culture. Jesus didn't use prayer to get God to back his words. He used words that were already backed by God. That's a reversal most people have never been taught. We're often taught to speak until God responds. Jesus listened until he knew what to say. And that listening changed everything. It meant his prayers were never uncertain, never rushed, never cluttered. They were clean, direct, unburdened by doubt. This is why Jesus could walk into situations everyone else feared. He wasn't reacting to what he saw. He was responding to what he heard. And when your words come from that place, they don't need intensity to be effective. They carry weight naturally. So here's the question this chapter leaves us with. If Jesus' authority came from alignment, what happens when prayer becomes more about speaking than listening? What if the power we're missing isn't something we lack, but something we're too distracted to hear? In the next chapter, we're going to explore one of the most overlooked elements of Jesus' prayer life, gratitude, and why, in his hands, it became a form of spiritual defiance rather than politeness. Gratitude is usually taught as manners. Say thank you after something goes well. Be grateful when the outcome is favorable. Acknowledge the blessing once it arrives. But Jesus used gratitude in a way that unsettles that framework completely. He gave thanks before anything changed. Not after the healing, not after the bread multiplied, not after the dead came back to life. Before. That alone tells us gratitude was not a reaction for him. It was a position. When Jesus lifted his eyes and gave thanks, he wasn't responding to what was visible. He was affirming what was already true in the unseen. That kind of gratitude doesn't come from optimism. It comes from agreement. Agreement that the situation is already settled at a level deeper than what the eyes can see. This is why his gratitude carried power. It refused to let circumstances define reality. At the feeding of the multitudes, the scene was chaotic. Thousands of people. Very little food. An obvious problem with no logical solution. The disciples saw lack. Jesus didn't deny the lack, but he didn't speak from it either. He gave thanks. And in doing so, he made a declaration without saying it directly. This is not the final story. Gratitude in that moment became an act of resistance. Resistance against fear. Resistance against limitation. Resistance against the idea that what is visible has the final word. And that's why gratitude was dangerous. Because someone who can thank God before the answer arrives is not controlled by outcomes. They are anchored somewhere deeper. Jesus' gratitude wasn't emotional hype. It wasn't positive thinking. It wasn't denial. It was alignment with a reality that had not yet manifested. That's why the miracle followed so naturally. The prayer didn't force multiplication. It acknowledged it. This is where many people misunderstand faith. They think faith is pretending everything is fine. But Jesus never pretended. He acknowledged the problem clearly, and then refused to let it define the conclusion. Gratitude was how he did that. Not by ignoring reality, but by choosing which reality to speak from. And here's the part most people miss. Gratitude before the miracle is only possible when you trust the source more than the situation. That trust is rare, and that's why this form of prayer was never popularized. Because systems built on fear cannot survive people who are no longer afraid. A grateful person before the outcome cannot be manipulated by uncertainty. So ask yourself this. What would change in your life if gratitude stopped being something you offered after relief and became something you declared in the middle of pressure? What kind of authority would emerge if your prayer began with certainty instead of anxiety? In the next chapter, we're going to confront why this way of praying was never fully passed down, why it doesn't fit neatly into systems of control, hierarchy, and dependency. There's a reason this way of praying feels unfamiliar. Not forgotten, unfamiliar. Because knowledge like this doesn't disappear by accident. It fades when it threatens structures that rely on dependence. A prayer rooted in identity doesn't need permission. A prayer rooted in alignment doesn't need intermediaries. And a prayer spoken with certainty doesn't require constant oversight. That kind of prayer doesn't fit neatly into systems built on hierarchy. From the beginning, Jesus' way of relating to God challenged religious order, not violently, not loudly, but fundamentally. He didn't undermine faith. He redefined access. And access is the one thing institutions guard most carefully. When Jesus prayed openly, he wasn't just modeling spirituality. He was demonstrating something dangerous: direct relationship. No ritual to unlock it. No status to earn it. No gatekeeper to approve it. That threatened the foundation of religious authority at the time. Because if people realized they could speak to God the way Jesus did, the entire power structure would collapse. That's why the tension around him wasn't really about miracles. It was about where he claimed his authority came from. He didn't say, "God listens to me because I'm special." He implied, "God listens to me because this is what relationship looks like." And if that relationship was possible for him, what did that mean for everyone else? After his death, the message spread, but it also shifted. Stories were preserved, miracles were celebrated, teachings were quoted, but the posture behind his prayer was harder to pass down. Because posture can't be institutionalized, it has to be lived. Over time, prayer slowly became safer, more scripted, more formal, more distant. Certainty was softened into hope. Authority was reframed as humility. Alignment was replaced with repetition, not because people were malicious, but because certainty is difficult to control. A person who knows they are heard doesn't need to be managed through fear. So instead of teaching people how Jesus prayed, systems focused on teaching people what to say. Instead of cultivating listening, they encouraged asking. Instead of reinforcing identity, they emphasized worthiness. And worthiness is a moving target. It keeps people coming back, keeps them unsure, keeps them dependent. Jesus' prayer life didn't create dependency. It created confidence. That's why it wasn't easily transferred. And that's why most people were never shown how to pray from connection, only how to pray toward it. This wasn't about hiding truth. It was about preserving order. But something gets lost when order becomes more important than intimacy. Prayer becomes mechanical. Miracles become exceptional, and faith becomes exhausting. Yet traces of Jesus' way of praying still remain. embedded in the text, waiting to be noticed, which brings us to the next layer. Because once you understand why this way of praying faded, you start to notice what replaced it. In the next chapter, we're going to look at how fear slowly reshaped prayer, and how Jesus consistently refused to let fear lead his words. Over time, something subtle but devastating happened to the way people approached prayer. Fear began to creep in, not always consciously, not always obviously, but it changed the way people spoke to God. Instead of praying with certainty, they began to pray with caution. Instead of speaking from identity, they spoke from insecurity. Instead of aligning with what was already true, they asked for permission they didn't need. This shift had consequences. Fear makes prayer transactional. It makes faith conditional. It makes miracles rare instead of natural. Think about it. When Jesus prayed, he never hesitated. He never measured the size of the problem against his words. He didn't fear failure. He didn't fear judgment. He didn't fear being unheard. He prayed from confidence in the relationship, not from hope that God might respond. But when fear enters the mind of a person praying, the words change. They become repetitive. They become elaborate. They become pleading. They no longer carry authority. They carry doubt, and doubt is heavy. It slows response. It weakens intention. This is why, in most Christian teaching today, prayer often feels like a chore. It feels like work. Like we have to say the right words in the right way to get results. That wasn't Jesus' model. He modeled alignment, listening, and certainty. He modeled speaking with authority because he spoke from identity, not anxiety. And that distinction is crucial because fear-based prayer does something else that goes largely unnoticed. It trains the mind to focus on lack. When you pray from fear, you're constantly scanning for problems, constantly anticipating what if it doesn't happen, constantly bargaining with God to intervene. Jesus' prayers were never about scanning for lack. They were about acknowledging what was already present in God's will. And that makes miracles inevitable, not miraculous. Here's the question most people never consider. If fear can replace faith in prayer, how many of the prayers we've offered in our lives have been held back by fear we didn't even notice? Jesus refused that path. He showed that prayer is strongest when fear is removed, when certainty is embraced, and when the speaker trusts the nature of the relationship itself. This is why the next chapter is so important. Because if fear is what replaced certainty for most people, then understanding how Jesus maintained fearless prayer is the key to unlocking what's been missing. The question that separates ordinary prayer from extraordinary prayer is simple. How did Jesus maintain fearless prayer in the face of impossible situations? The answer is not technique. It's not repetition. It's not ritual. It's identity. Jesus never doubted who he was or who he represented. Every word he spoke came from a place of certainty about his connection to the Father. Consider the moments when the stakes were highest. In the Garden of Gethsemane, facing imminent betrayal and death, he didn't panic. Even knowing the horror that awaited him, his prayer remained aligned with God's will. Father, not my will, but yours be done. Notice something here. Fear was present. Anxiety was real. But it did not control his words. It did not redefine his posture. Fearless prayer doesn't mean absence of fear. It means that fear is acknowledged, but it doesn't dictate your words or your belief. Jesus also maintained fearless prayer through clarity of purpose. Every miracle, every healing, every act of authority flowed from understanding why he was here. Not to show power, not to be celebrated, not to prove a point, but to reveal the nature of God. Because the purpose of prayer is not for God to notice you. It's for you to notice God. This is what keeps prayer fearless. Alignment with purpose. The third element is complete trust in the unseen. When Jesus prayed before miracles, he was always speaking from a place of certainty that what was unseen was more real than what was seen. Lazarus had been dead 4 days, yet Jesus didn't ask whether the Father could raise him. He prayed in certainty that life already existed beyond the tomb, and then he acted. This is where modern prayer often fails. We pray based on what we can see. We pray from what is obvious, limited, and tangible. We rarely anchor our words in what we already know spiritually to be true. Fearless prayer is not reactive. It is intentional. It is rooted in identity, purpose, and spiritual awareness. Ask yourself this. If you approached prayer not from what you hoped might happen, but from the certainty of alignment, purpose, and connection, how different would your life be? In the next chapter, we're going to explore the exact structure Jesus used in his prayers, the hidden formula behind every miracle he performed, the sequence that allowed certainty to flow naturally into action. When you read the Gospels closely, a pattern emerges. A structure, a rhythm, one that most people have missed because it doesn't look like prayer as we've been taught. Before every miracle, Jesus followed a subtle but unmistakable sequence, not words to memorize, but principles to inhabit. And understanding this structure changes the way prayer works entirely. Step 1. Recognition of the situation. Jesus never ignored reality. He saw the need. He acknowledged the sickness, the hunger, the death, but he never let the problem define him. Recognition is not doubt. It's clarity. The first step in powerful prayer is to be honest about what exists without letting it dictate the outcome. Step 2. Alignment with God. Next, he aligned himself with the Father. This is where most prayers fail today. We ask from a place of separation, uncertainty, or fear. Jesus prayed from a place of connection. He knew his will was already in harmony with God's will. He didn't try to convince God. He joined in with what God had already decided. Step 3. Gratitude before results. Then came gratitude, not for what had already happened, but for what was already true in heaven. Giving thanks in advance is not just emotional, it's strategic. It declares that the desired reality is already established, whether the eyes can see it yet or not. Gratitude here functions as a statement of authority. Step 4. Speaking with authority. Then came the words themselves, not frantic or fearful, not begging, just clear, concise, aligned speech. He said what he heard from the Father, not what he hoped might happen. Storms obeyed, diseases healed, the dead rose. This step is where invisible alignment becomes visible action. Step 5. Release without attachment. Finally, he released the prayer. There was no need for repeated pleading, no lingering in doubt. Jesus knew the effect of his words and trusted that heaven would respond. Release without attachment is where faith and certainty meet results. Notice something remarkable. Nowhere in this structure is there desperation, bargaining, or panic. Yet every miracle required action. This is what sets Jesus' prayer apart. Most prayers focus on step 4, on the words themselves, but skip the foundation, recognition, alignment, gratitude, and proper release. Without those, words have no authority. They are empty echoes. Ask yourself, how often do you pray without recognizing the problem fully? How often without aligning with God first? How often do you speak words that are not rooted in certainty? The hidden structure shows that miracles aren't random. They follow a rhythm, a method, but it's subtle, spiritual, and invisible to those who pray from fear or lack of identity. In the next chapter, we're going to go deeper into one of the most overlooked aspects of this rhythm: how Jesus spoke life into situations rather than asking God to do it. It's the moment where prayer and action converge. One of the most radical things Jesus did, and one of the most overlooked, is how he spoke in prayer. He didn't ask God to act. He didn't plead for intervention. He didn't negotiate with heaven. He spoke life. Consider the words he used. Lazarus, come out. Talitha, cum. Little girl, I say to you, get up. Be healed. Notice the difference. These aren't requests. They're commands, declarations, statements of what is already true in the unseen. Jesus spoke as if reality already reflected God's will. That is the essence of speaking life, aligning your words with what already exists in heaven and letting the spoken word manifest it on earth. This is why modern prayer often feels powerless. Many prayers focus on asking God to change reality. That assumes that reality is fixed and that God must be convinced. But Jesus didn't see it that way. For him, reality in heaven was already aligned with God's will. It just needed to be reflected on earth. Speaking life requires a shift in perspective. You no longer see prayer as a tool to convince God. You see it as a tool to align yourself with truth. The words become vehicles for the invisible to become visible. This also explains why gratitude comes before miracles. When you declare life before seeing it, you are not pretending. You are acknowledging the truth that already exists. And when your words reflect that truth, the world obeys them. Speaking life also requires confidence in the unseen. It requires a certainty rooted in intimacy with God. You cannot command life if you doubt your connection. That is why Jesus never hesitated. Ask yourself, how different would your life look if you stopped asking for things and started speaking them into existence? This is the critical step most people skip. Realizing that prayer is not just communication, it is creative action. The spoken word, when rooted in alignment, authority, and certainty, shapes reality. One of the most overlooked secrets in Jesus' prayer life is timing. The rhythm of when he spoke, when he waited, and when he acted was as important as the words themselves. Jesus never rushed miracles. He never forced outcomes prematurely. There was always a pause, a moment of stillness where the invisible aligned with the visible. Before Lazarus walked out of the tomb, before the storm was still, before the blind received sight, he paused and waited for the perfect alignment. This is where modern prayer often falls short. People assume urgency is the key. They pray frantically, repeat the same words over and over, and often act from impatience. But Jesus shows that the universe moves not by our hurry, but by perfect timing. Notice the pattern. He sees the need clearly. He doesn't deny the problem. He acknowledges God's will. Alignment is established first. He pauses. This is not inactivity. It's preparation, an opening for the unseen to respond. He speaks. Only after this pause does he declare life, healing, or transformation. Timing is what makes a prayer authoritative. Speaking too soon, without alignment, or without waiting for the invisible to precede the visible, produces words with no weight. The invisible always precedes the visible. This is a principle Jesus demonstrated consistently. Reality shifts first in the spiritual, and then it manifests in the physical. The miracle is never the starting point. It's the confirmation of alignment already established in heaven. Ask yourself, how often do you act too quickly in prayer? How often do you speak without listening? How often do you seek results before the invisible has shifted? Understanding timing changes everything. It teaches patience, trust, and faith that does not waver when the world seems still or chaotic. Timing also ensures that your words carry authority because they emerge in harmony with God's rhythm, not your panic. This principle also connects directly to one of Jesus' most radical practices: his detachment from the outcome. He spoke life, but he never clung to results in anxiety. He trusted that what was already true in heaven would manifest in its perfect moment. In the next chapter, we'll explore the role of detachment in prayer. Why releasing your words without grasping the outcome is the hidden key that most Christians have never been taught. One of the most misunderstood aspects of prayer is this: the moment you grasp for results, you weaken your own authority. Jesus never clung to outcomes. He never repeated his words out of desperation. He never doubted that what he had spoken aligned perfectly with God's will. This is the power of detachment. Detachment does not mean indifference. It does not mean passivity. It does not mean giving up. Detachment is a profound trust that what has been aligned in heaven will manifest in its own perfect time. It's the recognition that the work of prayer is not in convincing God. It is in participating in alignment, speaking life, and releasing it. Consider the stories of Jesus raising the dead or calming storms. He did not argue with the conditions. He did not bargain with God or plead repeatedly. He declared, and then he stepped back. The miracle followed, not because he demanded it, but because he released it. Detachment creates space for the invisible to act. When you cling to results, your fear and anxiety fill the space. Your words lose weight. Your faith becomes conditional. But when you speak life and release it, you allow the unseen to move unhindered. That is why Jesus' miracles felt effortless. His authority was never compromised by attachment, doubt, or worry. Ask yourself, how often do you pray while holding tightly to the outcome? How often do you repeat your requests because of fear, not faith? How different would your prayers be if you trusted the unseen more than the visible? Detachment also connects back to gratitude. Gratitude before the outcome is an act of detachment. It acknowledges the truth already present and releases your expectation into divine timing. This is where most modern teachings fail. Prayer is often framed as persuasion. Convince God, ask repeatedly, beg earnestly. Jesus reframed prayer as participation, align, speak, and release. Understanding detachment allows you to pray like Jesus did. You move from desperation to authority. You move from hoping to knowing. You move from trying to control life to joining with the flow of what already exists in the spiritual. In the next chapter, we're going to bring all of this together: alignment, gratitude, authority, timing, and detachment, to reveal how you can start praying like Jesus today, in a way that transforms ordinary moments into the miraculous. Everything we've explored, the alignment, the authority, the gratitude, the timing, the detachment, comes together in a way that transforms prayer from a ritual into a life-altering practice. Praying like Jesus today is not about memorizing formulas or repeating words until something happens. It's about entering a rhythm, a pattern that mirrors his own. Here's what that looks like in practice. Step 1. See clearly. Begin by acknowledging the reality of your situation. Be honest about what's present without letting it define the outcome. Jesus always recognized the problem before declaring the solution. Honesty and observation is the foundation of powerful prayer. Step 2. Align, fully connect with God from a place of identity and relationship. Speak internally from certainty that you are heard, that you belong, and that your words are in harmony with the Father. This is the unseen foundation upon which every miracle rests. Step 3. Give gratitude in advance. Speak gratitude for what is already true in heaven, even if it hasn't manifested yet in the physical world. Gratitude before results declares authority and invites the unseen into the visible. Step 4. Speak life. Use words that declare reality, not plead for it. Speak from faith that what you declare is already aligned with God's will. These words carry power because they come from alignment, not anxiety. Step 5. Release without attachment. Step back from the outcome. Do not obsess over timing, results, or external validation. Trust that the invisible is already in motion. Your role is participation, not persuasion. Step 6. Listen between words. Prayer is not one-sided. Jesus modeled listening as much as speaking. Pay attention to the quiet guidance within. Align your words to what you hear in that space. Miracles follow clarity. When practiced consistently, these steps create a transformative rhythm. Prayer becomes a conversation, a declaration, and a co-creative act with God. Ordinary problems begin to shift. Situations previously deemed impossible start responding. Ask yourself, what would happen if you approached every challenge with this rhythm? How would your relationships, health, work, and peace of mind change if your prayers carried authority instead of desperation? How would life change if you spoke with certainty and released outcomes to divine timing? Praying like Jesus is not reserved for the few. It is available to anyone willing to shift posture, from fear to identity, from asking to declaring, from attachment to trust. The truth is simple. Jesus' prayer model is not complicated. It is radical because it defies the fear, doubt, and limitation most people carry. When applied, it transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary and the unseen into the visible. Your invitation is clear. Start today. See clearly. Align. Give thanks. Speak life. Release. Listen. And watch how your life begins to reflect the miraculous rhythm of Jesus' prayers. Because once you pray this way, nothing is ever the same again. After everything we've uncovered, the hidden rhythm, the authority, the gratitude, the timing, the detachment, one thing becomes clear. Prayer, the way Jesus modeled it, is not about asking God to move. It's about aligning with what is already true, declaring life, and trusting that the unseen is already at work. It's not about repetition, ritual, or desperation. It's about identity. It's about confidence in the Father. It's about speaking with authority from a place of connection. This is why his miracles didn't feel like exceptions. They were natural extensions of alignment between heaven and earth. And this is why so few were ever taught to pray this way. Because certainty, authority, and fearless faith cannot be controlled or diluted. It is radical, it is transformative, it is a practice that changes everything for anyone willing to step into it. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. You don't need permission to pray with authority. You don't need validation to speak life. You don't need certainty from the outside. You can cultivate it from within. After everything we've uncovered, the hidden rhythm, the authority, the gratitude, the timing, the detachment, one thing becomes clear. Prayer, the way Jesus modeled it, is not about asking God to move. It's about aligning with what is already true, declaring life and trusting that the unseen is already at work. It's not about repetition, ritual, or desperation. It's about identity. It's about confidence in the Father. It's about speaking with authority from a place of connection. This is why his miracles didn't feel like exceptions. They were natural extensions of alignment between heaven and earth. And this is why so few were ever taught to pray this way. Because certainty, authority, and fearless faith cannot be controlled or diluted. It is radical. It is transformative. It is a practice that changes everything for anyone willing to step into it. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. You don't need permission to pray with authority. You don't need validation to speak life. You don't need certainty from the outside. You can cultivate it from within.